Gangland Gunplay, Skirmish Wargame Rules for 20th Century Combat. In this video I set out the basic rules for the wargame I call Gangland Gunplay, which enables you to play out small-scale fights in an urban setting. I also explain what I was trying to achieve when I wrote the rules, and so why the rules were written in the way that they were. As ever, if you would like a PDF of the rules, then drop me an email at the channel's email address. The inspiration for writing these rules was seeing a number of videos about skirmish wargames set in the Wild West. Now, I could just have taken my manic medieval mayhem rules and added firearms. That would have been easy and allowed me to fight those sorts of games. But I wanted something a little bit more granular. Manic medieval mayhem is a simplified, quick play system. Statistics are generic rather than varying between figures. The rules are written to minimise any record keeping. All you need to know is whether a figure is armoured and what weapon it is carrying, and this can be done by looking at the model. To avoid record keeping, there is no concept of a figure being wounded. Either an attack kills a figure or it has no effect. Now, these simplifications are great if you are playing a game with, say, 10 figures on each side. Keeping individual records of bespoke statistics and status for that number of figures would significantly slow the game down, and each individual figure is less important in terms of the overall result. However, if you are playing a game with 2 or 3 figures on each side, then having a certain amount of record keeping is less of a problem and allows for more personalisation of, and so a greater level of engagement with, each figure involved. The flip side, of course, is that these more detailed rules are not designed for larger battles. For games of Gangland Gunplay, I think that 4 figures a side is ideal. With only 8 figures on the table, you can identify with each figure as an individual, rather than as just another foot soldier. Such a game can still be played out in an hour or so, and thus the increased level of granularity is manageable and adds to the game. But as the number of figures on the table increases beyond this level, this equation rapidly reverses, and a simplified rule set is, in my view, better. Anyway, that is why I wrote these rules. But the more observant among you will have noted that these are billed as 20th century rules, but the era of gunfighting in the Wild West was the 19th century. So what's the story here? The answer is simply the cost of obtaining toy soldiers with which to play the game. There are lots of 28mm plastic figures for the Wild West. They are too expensive for my taste. I wanted figures that were large enough to have individuality, but cheap enough that I could justify buying them. The sweet spot is 20mm plastics. But getting hold of Wild West figures in that scale is difficult. On the other hand, there are plenty of 20th century 1/72nd scale plastic figures available. Redbox have a box of figures called Gangsters and another called Policemen and Civilians. Dark Alliance produce Rednecks, Zombies, Survivors, and so on, which can all be used in a 20th century setting. I also quite liked the idea of having characters wielding submachine guns and chainsaws, neither of which were prevalent in the Wild West. Having said that, you could use these rules for a Wild West gunfight. You could also use them for playing Al Capone-style gangster shootouts, conflicts between biker gangs, post-apocalyptic zombie scenarios, Bodie and Doyle taking down terrorists, or aggro between firms of football hooligans. Basically, any scenario where people are fighting with small arms or hand-to-hand while wearing their normal clothes. There are rules for cars, but not for armoured vehicles. Okay, so I have set out the purpose and scope of these rules. But how do they actually work? Well, as with any rule set, the core is the activation system. Each figure on the table has a unique playing card assigned to it. These cards are shuffled together into a deck, along with a joker. The cards are then turned one at a time. When a figure's card is turned, that figure gets to activate. When the joker is turned, the round ends. All the cards are returned to the deck, and the deck is reshuffled. When a figure is activated, it rolls 3 dice, or potentially less than 3 dice if the figure has been wounded. We'll come back to that. The number rolled on each die corresponds to a specified action. Although the figure rolls multiple dice, it can only select one of the numbers rolled. It then takes that single action or chooses to do nothing. Once it has taken its action, another card is turned and another figure gets to activate. Note that restricting figures to a single action per activation was a purposeful design choice. It keeps the game moving and creates more opportunities for figures to interact and react to the actions of other figures. The actions corresponding to each number that might be rolled are shown on screen. The activation mechanic creates uncertainty at 2 levels. Firstly, when a figure is activated, the dice rolled may not permit it to take the action desired. Secondly, because of the joker, a figure may not get to activate at all in any given round. Now, all this uncertainty works well in a solo game where the intention is to let a story unfold itself rather than to play out some meticulously pre-designed set of chess moves. After all, it is not unlikely that someone caught up in a high-pressure situation, such as being in the middle of a street fight, might freeze or act in a manner that is a bit random. But some people might find this feature of the rules frustrating. If you are one of these people, or if you are playing a game against an opponent rather than solo, you may want a bit more predictability as to when your figures get to try to do things. In this case, I would omit the joker from the deck. The turn will then end when all the cards in the deck have been turned. This way, every figure gets activated every turn, but there is still some friction as the activation dice may be unkind. Okay, now let's run through each of the possible actions in a bit more detail. A roll of 1 permits the figure to withdraw. This is the same as a move action, which we will cover in a minute, with the additional restriction that at no point in its move can the withdrawing figure reduce the distance between it and the nearest enemy figure to which it then has, or previously in its move had, a clear line of sight. So, what about a standard move? That can be taken on a roll of 2. The figure may move up to its movement allowance or up to its terrain movement allowance, which is 2 inches less, if it encounters terrain. Movement can be in any direction, and a figure can change direction as often as desired during a move. A figure can move through friendly figures, but not enemy ones. Indeed, a figure cannot even move into contact with an enemy figure. If a moving figure starts its turn in contact with an enemy figure, it must immediately move out of contact with the enemy figure it is in contact with. A melee attack can be made on a roll of 3. A melee attacking figure that is not already in contact with an enemy figure must move in a single straight line without changing direction directly into contact with one or more enemy figures, and then strike at one of the enemy figures it is now in contact with. The attacking figure must stop moving as soon as it contacts any enemy figure. Otherwise, the usual rules for movement apply to a melee attacking figure. A figure that starts its move in contact with an enemy figure cannot be ordered to melee attack a different enemy figure. If such a figure is ordered to melee attack, it must stay where it is and strike at an enemy figure that it is already in contact with. To strike at an enemy figure, roll a die. If the figure being struck at is using a weapon with a defense value higher than the attack value of the weapon being used by the striking figure, then subtract 1 from the roll. If the striking figure is using a weapon with an attack value that is higher than the defense value of the weapon being used by the figure being struck, then add 1 to the roll. If the modified roll is greater than or equal to 4, then the strike results in a hit. We will talk about what happens when a figure is hit later. Note that any weapon, including range weapons, can be used to make a melee attack. I can always hit you with the gun I am holding, rather than firing it at you. Let's give an example. Suppose a fight is going on between an unruly football supporter and an officer of the law. The hooligan is throwing punches at the police constable, who is defending himself with a truncheon. The key statistics for these weapons are shown on screen. The hooligan's fists have an attack value of 1. The defense value of the truncheon is also 1. There is thus no adjustment to the roll, and the hit will be scored on a 4+. Conversely, if the brutal policeman strikes back at the unarmed football fan, the policeman's truncheon has an attack value of 2 compared to the fan's defense value of 1. As the attack value is higher than the defense value, 1 is added to the roll, and the policeman will hit his opponent on an unadjusted roll of 3+. So much for melee attacks. Now let's move on to an activation roll of 4. This allows a figure either to change the weapon it is using or to reload it. A figure can be equipped with multiple weapons, but at any time only one of them will be available to use. At the start of the game, each figure specifies which weapon it is using. On a roll of 4, a figure can change the specified weapon for another of the weapons it is carrying. Note that fists count as a weapon, so every figure will have at least one weapon it can use. The other option on a roll of 4 is to reload the weapon that is currently being used. This only applies to range weapons. Roll a die, and that number of rounds can be loaded into the weapon, up to the weapon's maximum capacity as shown on screen. Or, for magazine-loaded weapons, a new magazine can be loaded into the weapon. The concept of loading does not apply to thrown range weapons. Such a weapon may be thrown in a range attack whenever it is the weapon being used by the figure. Once thrown, the weapon cannot be used again by any figure, and the figure that threw it automatically reverts to using its fists until it uses a 4 to start using another weapon. An activation roll of 5 allows a figure to make a single range attack with the weapon it is currently using, assuming that that is a range weapon. Note that not all weapons can make range attacks. A range attack may be made on any figure within the range of the weapon being used, to which there is a clear line of sight. A range attack can be made in any direction. The weapon used to make the attack must be loaded with ammunition. A range attack can be made on a figure that is in contact with the range attacking figure, so you can shoot someone who's in your face. However, a range attack cannot be made on a figure that is in contact with a third figure that is friendly to the range attacking figure. To make a range attack, roll a die. Subtract 1 from the result if the target figure is in cover. If the modified roll is greater than or equal to the attacking weapons to hit number, then a hit has been scored. different weapons have different to hit numbers depending on how easy it is to hit a target with them. So, for example, a revolver has a to hit value of 5. It will therefore hit its target on a roll of 5+ if that target is in the open, or 6+ if that target is in cover. Finally, on an activation roll of 6, a figure can take any one of the actions 1 to 5 that I have just described. Alternatively, it may recover 1 wound that it has previously lost in the game. The only other basic rules to cover are those relating to terrain, line of sight, and resolving hits. The terrain rules are very simple. There are 2 types of terrain, being high obstacles and low obstacles. High obstacles block line of sight and are impassable. They include things like tall walls, individual trees, and buildings. Low obstacles do not block line of sight. They do provide cover. Figures moving over, into, or through one or more low obstacles are restricted to their terrain movement allowance. Low obstacles include fences, low walls, shrubbery, and cars. The next things to talk about are line of sight and the related matter of cover. In establishing line of sight for range attacks, there are 2 key concepts to consider. The first is the sighting corridor. This is the corridor between the range attacking and target figures defined by the extremities of their bases, as shown on screen. The second concept is sighting lines. A sighting line is a line that is traced from any point on the perimeter of the range attacking figure's base to any point on the perimeter of the target figure's base. There are therefore lots of sighting lines, all contained within the sighting corridor. In order to have a clear line of sight to another figure, several conditions have to be met. The first condition is that there is no third figure with any part of its base in the sighting corridor between the range attacking and target figure. So if there's any part of another figure's base in that corridor, you do not have a line of sight. You cannot range attack that target figure. The second condition to have a clear line of sight is that there is at least one sighting line between the range attacking figure and the target figure that does not cross a high obstacle. So if the sighting corridor is partially blocked by a high obstacle, you've still got a clear line of sight, but if the high obstacle blocks off the entire sighting corridor, you don't have a line of sight. Now, a target figure is in cover if there is any part of a high or low obstacle in the sighting corridor, and the range attacking figure is not in contact with that obstacle. So if you're in contact with the obstacle that you're firing round or over, your target does not benefit from cover. But if you're not in contact, if you're stood back from it, your target is treated as being in cover. Okay, so that's line of sight and cover. That leaves the process for resolving hits. Now this process is identical regardless of whether the hit is a result of a melee attack or the result of a range attack. The first step is to roll 2 dice to establish if the figure has been killed, and if not, the number of wounds that it has suffered. So if the total of these 2 dice, without any adjustments applied, is less than or equal to the striking weapon's kill value, the struck figure is killed and immediately removed from play. If the unmodified roll exceeds the striking weapon's kill value, then add the impact value of the striking weapon to the roll. The table on screen shows the number of wounds inflicted on the struck figure based on this adjusted roll. For a result up to 11, you get 1 wound. For 12 you get 2, for 13 you get 3, for 14 you get 4 wounds, and so on. Each figure has a vigour statistic. If the number of wounds inflicted equals or exceeds the figure's remaining vigour, then the figure is rendered unconscious and removed from play. Otherwise, the figure loses 1 point of vigour for each wound inflicted. Now, I mentioned earlier that wounds may affect the number of dice a figure rolls when it is activated. A figure with remaining vigour of 3 or more rolls 3 dice. A figure with remaining vigour of 2 only rolls 2 dice. A figure with only 1 point of vigour remaining rolls a single die. Thus, as wounds are taken, the choice of actions available to an activated figure reduces. To return to the process of resolving hits, if the figure that has been hit is not killed or rendered unconscious, a second roll is made to see how far it is pushed back. Roll a single die and refer to the table on screen to see whether and how far the struck figure has been pushed back by the blow. If you roll a 1, 2 or 3, you get pushed back that number of inches. If you roll a 4, 5 or 6, there's no pushback. The struck figure should be moved the specified distance directly away from the figure that hit it, and whether that figure hit it in a melee attack or by a range attack doesn't matter. Move directly away from the attacking figure. And if you can't move that full distance, then you move such shorter distance as prevents you from moving into or through another figure or an impassable obstacle. Let's illustrate all this by going back to our previous example. So assume that our football hooligan has successfully landed a punch upon the policeman. The kill value of the hooligan's fist is 1. As the lowest possible total of 2 dice is 2, it is not possible for this blow to be fatal, which is good news for the policeman. The impact value of the hooligan's fist is 2. This is therefore added to the sum of the 2 dice. If the result is 11 or less, the policeman will take 1 wound, otherwise he will take more. If the policeman is still standing, roll another dice to see whether, and if so, how far he is pushed back. Assume that our policeman is still standing and up for the fight, and that when he is next activated, he lands a return blow on his assailant. We see that the kill value of the truncheon is 2. A roll of double 1 will therefore kill the troublesome hooligan dead on the spot. Assuming a double 1 is not rolled, then the truncheon's impact value of 4 will be added to the total of the 2 dice in order to establish the number of wounds inflicted, as before. If the hooligan is not knocked cold, then again make a roll to see if he is pushed back by the blow, and if so, how far. That covers all of the basic rules. There are some other rules for things like cars and hand grenades and my campaign rules, but I'm not intending to cover them here. They are covered in the written version of the rules if you want to email me for a copy. Alternatively, if there is sufficient public demand in the comments section, I will make another video covering the additional rules. The last things you will need to actually play the game are the various statistics for figures and weapons. Let's start with figures. The statistics that need to be generated for each figure are vigour, strength, and movement allowances. Vigour is the number of wounds a figure can take before being rendered incapable of further action. In most cases, this will be 4. A very resilient person might have a vigour of 5, a more fragile one a vigour of 3. Strength is exactly what you would imagine it to be. Its main role in the game is to determine how hard characters hit each other. Most figures will have a strength of 1, but a few very muscular outliers might have a strength of 2, and weedier people might have strength of 0. If you want to generate these statistics randomly, roll a die for each and refer to the tables on screen. If the character you are generating is a woman, I would subtract 1 from each roll to reflect the biological fact that on average women are weaker than men, but that might be because I am a sexist dinosaur. That leaves movement allowances. Roll a die and add 6. You will have a number between 7 and 12. That is the figure's unencumbered movement allowance. Now add up the encumbrance values of all the figure's equipment and ammunition as shown on screen. Divide that total by 3 and round to the nearest whole number. This is the figure's encumbrance deduction. Subtract the encumbrance deduction from the unencumbered movement allowance to give the figure's movement allowance. The movement allowance is the distance in inches a figure can move when activated if it does not encounter terrain. The terrain movement allowance, which is the distance a figure can move if it does encounter terrain, is 2 inches less than the movement allowance. Note that these movement allowances are fixed at the beginning of a game. They do not change during a game as a figure throws knives or uses up ammunition or whatever. Life is too short for that sort of fiddling about. Now, all we have to do is to establish the basic statistics for the figure's weapons and we're ready to go. Note that a figure will always have at least one weapon, being its fists. These weapon statistics are simply looked up using the tables on screen. The only adjustment is that the melee impact value shown on the tables should be increased by the figure's strength. So basically you're adding 0, 1 or 2. In most cases 1. In order to keep track of everything during a game, I use a dashboard for each figure, similar to the one shown on screen, and some counters. The figure's name and the playing card which activates it are written in the boxes at the top. The main part of the dashboard is the weapons table. Use one row of this table for each weapon carried. The type of weapon is written in the left-hand column, with the relevant weapon statistics written in the columns in the body of the table. The very right-hand column is used to keep track of the amount of ammunition loaded in the weapon. Place a number of counters on the dashboard in the relevant ammo box equal to the number of rounds loaded in the weapon, and remove a counter each time the weapon is fired. Indicate which weapon the figure is currently using by placing a counter in the relevant row of the weapons column on the left. The figure's vigour statistic should be written in the vigour box. Also place this number of counters on the dashboard in this box and remove one each time the figure takes a wound. That's an easy way to see if you've got less than 3 counters left, you'll be rolling less than 3 activation dice. The figure's movement allowance and terrain movement allowance are written in the move box. If the figure is carrying additional ammunition that is not loaded into the weapon, an appropriate number of counters should be placed in the reloads box and transferred to the relevant ammo box on the weapons table as ammunition is loaded into the weapon. If more than one range weapon is carried, use different coloured counters for each type of ammunition. Alright, I think that is more than enough for now. I hope you have found this run through the rules interesting, and maybe some of you will give the game a go. As I said previously, if you drop me an email, I will send you a PDF of the rules. As I mentioned earlier, this PDF includes some campaign rules, and I have been playing a little campaign based in the imaginary English town of Huddsborough. Some videos showing how events in that campaign turn out will follow in due course.